Hey everyone, it's Ken Pooch Van Druten, and
This is Chris Rabold, right here with the Christmas spirit.
Chris Rabold with the spirit of Christmas.
That's it.
Right there.
Yep.
Good for you, man. We put our tree up as well. I don't know, actually probably like about a week and a half ago. And it's feeling very Christmassy in my house. It's nice.
That's cool.
But we aren't going to have Christmas, so that's a little weird. I mean,
however, the world sucks, so who cares what we did?
I mean, literally, like we decided probably. We haven't totally decided yet, but I don't think we're going to have family over. So anyway, that'll be that. But hey, it's only 1 year, hopefully.
Totally.
We'll see what happens.
Yep.
So other than that, how's life? What's happening? You doing okay?
Yeah.
Like you got a haircut.
Things are things. I know. I look like I'm going to the military. But, you know, it's one of those, maybe. I don't know.
It's a valid question.
Sure. You know how it is? I go like get my haircut and they're doing it right. Everyone's masked up and this and that. But I'm like, I don't want to be in here. I'd like to be in here as little as possible. Just go for it, you know? So, but yeah, whatever. Things are good, man. I don't know. I'm just trudging along. You know, for the first time, it's so funny. There's the tiniest, we finally have a true indicator marker of a light of hope.
A light of hope.
Like it's like as far as ahead of us, it's like I see it. I see the possibility for actual movement and turn, and with regards to vaccines and stuff. But it's coming at the same exact time as utter chaos. You know, so it's kind of a weird time. I'm just like everybody else, just waiting out the clock, just trying to get there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really hoping that this dumpster fire of a year finishes soon and it gets better. You know, I don't know that the beginning of 2021 will be better, but maybe it will.
And I mean, but that's the news is that it's like it's going to suck really bad, but there's finally the ability for it to start to turn. Some of the markers we've needed are finally there, you know, so.
Yes.
Whatever. But it's fucked. But you're fucked in the meantime.
Yeah.
You know? So
well, that's all right. I mean, at least we can come around here and talk a little bit about audio and try to take our minds off of it. So
here we go.
We hope you guys are enjoying some of that. That live stream last week went very well, I think.
That was excellent. Thank you guys so much for coming. Or if you're watching after the fact, I know it's gotten a lot of views afterwards too. So yeah, that was a big success.
Yeah, and we'll definitely do it again. But also, guys, don't forget to like and subscribe to our videos, and if you guys make some comments on videos, we try to address those as well during these ones that we're recording. So either save your comments for the upcoming live stream. I don't know. We'll probably do another one. I don't know. Maybe the first part of the year or something. Huh?
Yeah, sure.
And for now, we'll do some of these and release these to you. So thanks for hanging out with us, and we sure do appreciate it. I thought today that we talk about, lately kind of in the ones that we've been recording anyway, we've been going kind of back to basics, like kick drum. We did a whole episode about kick drum. And I thought that maybe we also go back to basics in general and talk about like what is at the forefront of your thought process as you're mixing, right? Like, what are the most important things as you're going along? What's the first most important thing to the last? And, in doing some of these master classes, and also teaching some other things, I have kind of my own opinions about what those things are. And I've broken it down for me into the 5 things that you should concentrate on when you're mixing. And the first one for me is all about balance. So the point is for me, the way that I think about it is, I'm not trying to think of a million things at once. I'm taking things one step at a time. And I look at mixing, the mixing process of the very first thing that I look at when I have 128 inputs in front of me is balancing those inputs without any EQ, without any, doing compression, without any of the other stuff, just trying to get those things to balance with each other. I'm not even talking about panning. I'm just talking about how are those 128 things or less? Say you have 32 things. How do you make those 32 things balance with each other? And that's kind of where I start. But I'd be interested to know like what your thought process is.
Yeah. If I'm understanding it correctly, what are we looking at? What are these, 5 things? I guess it sort of kind of depends on, well, at what point are we picking up in the action? You know what I mean?
Well, I'm talking about from the beginning. So when you approach a mix, you're given, say it's not yours. Say someone sent you 32 tracks of stuff and you're starting from the beginning. What's the first things that you look for? How do you start your mix?
Yeah. To me, just because, you posed this to me and at least the way I'm understanding it, the first thing I think of is basically, I think I start with your thing is kind of number 2 in my mind, because while I don't spend a ton of time in solo, I do listen to sources in isolation early on. So I think for me, the way that I would phrase this would be, step 1, the thing that I focus on first is the tonality, and it's a quick and dirty version though. Tonality of sources would be number 1 for me. So as these things come to me, it is a push up of the fader, but then it is with some dolling up of some sort. Like if it needs it, I will do a little something. That to me, that's it. It is the tonality of the sources. And then we get in a big chase our tail thing here in a little while. Once we start balancing and rebalancing and finding that the tonal aspect of something in isolation is nothing like what it is in mass, Yeah. So, but yeah, I would say that for me would be like kind of sculpting ever so gently the tonality of the sources as they come to me.
So let's take an example. I just want to, so that it's clear to you kind of what I'm saying. Let's take an example, a 32 track thing someone sends to you. It's virtual playback. You've never heard any of the sources before. What do you listen to things individually and then try to get a balance together, or do you just go to kick drum and start with kick drum and start EQing it, or what's your process?
Yeah, if there was like a 2 mix with it, of course I'd listen to the mix. But if it's just those tracks and nothing but, sure, I would go through something where I would push everything up just to see what we're working with.
Yep.
More on an exploratory level though. Like if I knew nothing about it other than here are your 32 tracks, I would push everything up and listen to just get an idea of where we're going. But shortly after that, once I established, okay, I see what everything is, then I would move to starting over everything down, and then I'd start pulling things up.
I get it. I am balance is the most important thing in my book in general for me. Okay. So when I am constantly balancing and rebalancing whenever I do all of the other things like panning and EQ and compression and all of those things by adding some gain structure change, by either adding or subtracting EQ, and also, doing some compression or limiting. It forces my balance to get out of whack. So, I guess I'm just trying to stress to people how important balance is. And it to me, it's like the forefront of my thought process. I'm constantly rebalancing once I start doing other things. So let me just run through the 5, all right? Because we just started with 1 and we didn't run through the 5. So the 5 for me are this: there's balance and rebalance. Then there's panning is the second most important thing in my thought process. Then there's EQ, which is especially high pass, low pass filtering, right? We've talked about that in the past. And then there's compression, and then the final thing that I kind of think about in the end is depth, right? So it's balance, then placement, then EQ, then compression, and then depth. Those are in order what my thought process is of how I approach a mix from scratch.
Got it.
And so I'm just trying to
I get it.
Go through your methodology of how you approach I think people want to hear, like, you get 32 tracks you never heard before. So what do you do? Like, what are your steps that you make?
Yep. Yeah. And I think in the way, again, just getting on board with lining up with the concept here. For me, the 5 quickly mimic yours, but it's just, you asked, that's my answer.
Yeah.
The tonality of this. So of course I get the tracks. I need to know what we're looking at. Like, what is this thing supposed to look at? So there would be an exploratory push to just get it all up there, to listen, to see how often things are, what the sources are, how important they are, how they mesh, this and that. Quickly after that though, and this is where my list would begin, would be pull them all down. And then I just start bringing them in. And at that point, the first would be the tonality of source. And what I mean is that's just as it gets served as it's served to me. Like, I pull up the next one, it's time to deal with that one. I pull up the next one, it's time to deal with that one. At that point, my mind on a mix level starts getting into balance, but it's specifically first, it is balance in terms of amplitude. Like so, if I'm, and I'll just go ahead and tell you so this makes sense. The second or the third thing then becomes balance in terms of frequency summing. So I've taken the source, I've done something to it to give it a presentable start. I bring it to the party. And then I bring something else in, and I'm just listening to literally is one louder than the other. Okay, I think it's cool, and that's done with amplitude and panning though. So I would think of panning that early on, like it would be part of kind of sort of moving things around a little bit. And so then the next step becomes, so then I've got a general balance. I've got a balance of all 32 items, really just based on amplitude and their placement in the spectrum. At that point, I move into how do they all interact sonically. And then I might start to change this one tonally a little to make this one fit. I don't do a ton of that, but that's when I start looking at how are we behaving? What's the tonal output now of this mix?
I always tell people, like, mixing in mono is the hardest thing in the world to do.
So hard. It's so hard.
It is. And the reason is that 50% of what I do in the beginning has to do with panning, like separation and trying to get things out of the way of each other in the space that we have, that is the stereo spectrum, left to right. And so that's why, for me, panning is right up front there. It's right next to, balance, even before EQ and compression.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of things that I don't have to EQ and compress if I can get them out of the way of each other. You know what I mean? And so panning to me becomes one of the most important things, just like you. And that's why also for me, depth is last, because you have this left to right, you get everything like working together, left to right, and compression and EQ wise. And then in the end you go, you know what? I need to make and this is a step that I think a lot of people don't do. They get to the spot where it's like, okay, everything's apart from each other. You can hear everything individually, and you can hear they're nicely EQ'd individual things, and they have a space to them. But then they don't do that last step, which I think is like the pro step, the depth move, right?
Yeah, sure.
Like, let's make things be farther away from you or closer to you. And to me, that's what separates an amazing mix versus just an okay mix, is that last step of depth. But before we get there, just like what you said, it's all about balance and panning and EQ and, all of those kind of things. So...
after for me, the way I'm looking at it, after I've got the amplitude, and I should specify when I say tonality of source being number one, that for me, I'm basically saying that includes, so for me, dynamically treating to some degree a source does happen early on.
Yep.
So I'll do that early on. Then we start getting into, so 1, tonality of source, 2, balance in terms of amplitude, 3, balance in terms of now that they're all together, frequency summing. And then once I start tweaking with that leads to what I've written down, number 4, which is then this tireless balancing and rebalancing, which is what you said. It's just because as you introduce, faders up or faders one at a time, it's still going to equal the same thing. And as things are introduced and as they become prominent, as they become louder in the mix, or as you try to give something some energy, it tweaks the balance a little, So then you get into this thing of this constant rebalance, and a rebalance on a mix. I don't know about you, but that's common for me. I'll turn to do something, come back to do one thing, and just instinctually reach over and touch a fader, give it like just a little love kiss. And then, at the end of all of it, for me, I put embellishment. And I guess what that means is once we've got things to live together amplitude wise, and in turn dynamically, once we've got things to live together tonally on a frequency level, then I'll start getting into effects, which effects are just depth, That's when all that stuff comes out. You can be pretty jamming early on before you've turned on a single effect.
Totally.
So that comes on at the end. That's when we start doing all the sweetening stuff. That's all the fun stuff. But that's the very last. That's like dessert.
I think I think we should talk about. There's a lot of. It takes a little bit of experience for a mixer to discover about frequency masking and also placement masking that happens when you start putting things together, right? Like we talk about this a lot where you can listen to an individual thing by itself, panned at 1 o'clock by itself with its EQ, sounds phenomenal. That guitar at 1 o'clock by itself sounds phenomenal. But as soon as you start crowding other stuff into it and start panning something at 12:30 and 1:30 that are kind of sharing the same frequency spectrum, that thing starts to be not as cool. And even so much so, you can actually bury something that sounds great by itself. If you solo it up in solo in place, let's say, so you hear the panning, you solo it up and you go, man, that sounds great. And you unsolo it and you go, I
don't understand.
What is happening? Right. And so there are this choices that I make further along down the road that get into being like extreme EQ.
Yeah.
Like sometimes, we've talked about this in the past, sometimes if you solo up some of my individual things in mixes, you would be perplexed. You'd be like, what is happening? But then you put it in the overall picture of what's happening and you go, oh, wow. It's the appearance of frequencies that aren't actually there. Like I've high passed something way the hell up. You solo it up and it's like, oh man, that's really bright and nasty. But then when you put it in with the other things that are panned at 12:30 and 1:30 that share frequency information, but also have low end to them, the appearance of that thing that you've placed at 1 o'clock is that it has those frequencies and that it is big and full and fat.
Right.
And that's a hard concept to grab, right? Like I have trouble teaching that. I can get students, I can get people to understand individual placement and, single inputs or single instruments, let's say, maybe if it's even multiple inputs, let's say it's 3 mics on a guitar or whatever, they can make that guitar sound amazing. But as soon as you put the rest of it in, it's like, wow, what happened? Yeah. Do you have any insight into that? Like, how can we help people to understand how that works?
Well, I think the thing that's interesting is, at that point, it is easy to take. It's nothing's easy, but it's one thing to take individual things like you're saying, in solo, literally, and make those into something. That's not mixing.
Yeah, right. It's not.
So
it's not, but it's the concept that they have trouble with, right? Like they go, well, it sounds great. I don't understand why it doesn't work with the rest.
And that's the deal. Like what we're really talking about is how are you as a mixer,
right?
I mean, it's just like I can have all the greatest spices in the world and just line them up right next to one another in the kitchen and be like, I'm a killer cook.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
look. look at what I have, you know, but you have to.
That's a great analogy. That's great.
You've got to put them all together. And so what you're talking about is the big divider, and the way that we make space, that we made them make the way we make the mix work and make that palatable is through balance, but it's balance in different ways. And it's what you've said and it's what I've said. There's both amplitude, there's frequency masking, there's things summing, there's things adding in a subtractive
there's compression
manner
to keep things from poking out at stuff, because if something has a bunch of EQ or amplitude to it, it can also shift stuff in your mix and make it sound nasty. So it's all of those things.
It's all of those things, and which one do you go to? Because you might pull off a move of an overall fader move of 3 dB that was the right move, or that could have been accomplished, with some EQ moves in the same. So and who's to say what's right and what's wrong in that? But that end result is what makes us all different mixers, and that's why. Right. At the end of the day, these mixes do come up sounding, can be quite markedly different sounding, depending on how they were put together and how they were built. So I think what you're talking about is it gets into the thing of where it comes down to both experience and instinct, and hopefully some study, some understanding that, because a lot of times you have a source that you pull up, it sounds great on its own. Then you start adding other sources. Suddenly you can't hear anything, but your stereo bus is about to explode.
Yeah.
So it's like, so what's that all about? So it's a tough concept.
It is a tough concept. And I've thought a lot about this, like how, because people send me mixes all the time to critique or listen to, or have suggestions about what's going on. And I would say the majority of the comments that I would have about some of the stuff that people send me is that like I can tell that the drum kit by itself probably sounds really great. Like the kit by itself without anything else on top of it. But the mix that they're sending me, the drum kit doesn't sound great because of all the other stuff that is frequency masking and also, too much compression and, that kind of stuff is making the overall result be not as cool. And I think that people have a struggle of getting over that hurdle. Like how do I figure out how to make this drum kit that sounds great now work with all the other stuff, right? And that's a hard concept to grab. And I think that is just what you said. It comes from experience, and it comes from doing it a bunch. Like if you guys are home right now, I would say do that all the time. Get some tracks and, try to figure out how to improve the rebalance after you've done compression and EQ and all of these things and panning. You then have to rebalance and then actually end up doing extreme things in order to make things punch through a mix, right? Or the other term is make things glue together. That's a hard thing to do too.
And that's it. I'm sitting here thinking, there's a concept in the studio, where an artist has demo love. Yeah. In other words, they had a song, it's an artist that doesn't write their own material. They had a song pitched to them. They love it. They love it. And no matter what happens in the studio with you recutting it with 1,000 times more effort and more talent and better gear and this and that, the artist can't not hear what they fell for in the demo. You know what I mean? And something, follow with me here, similar happens in mixing where, and I've spoken about it a lot on here, where whatever input you just focused on last suddenly is in first place. Yeah. And then before you know, it's like you're off to the races.
You're just build.
Yeah. And what's really hard is, how do you get that drum kit that by itself sounds great, yet can live with other things and does not have to be 4 times too loud to retain its greatness, Sure. And that's all that stuff's really, really hard. I was thinking the other day, I was driving around and I was thinking about, I may have mentioned this on here before, but I knew I had a mix that I liked, I got great results with for years. And then when I started and just in general, any kind of mix that I'd find myself working on, some better than others. But when I entered the world of having to compete against track, it was jarring in so many ways, but I will tell you, it made me a better mixer because I had to learn how to make my mix, which before was so powerful and so big, but then up against these over processed or perfectly processed or whatever studio tracks, my shit was anemic and it just didn't hit and it was dull compared to, so it was like, that was when, and so that was a huge experience for me. But on the other side of it, it made me a lot better because I did have to learn. It just taught me how to, the more stuff that's coming in, how do you make it all matter and not get lost and not just have this boring wall of sound or this wall of just where nothing means anything,
Yeah. I try to tell people that you can't just keep adding. So let's just talk about frequency wise. You can't just keep adding more things to make stuff, have frequency spectrum wise, from wherever your mix starts, at 40 hertz all the way up to, 16, 18K. If you add something frequency spectrum wise, then something else has to suffer, right? So there's this kind of push and pull thing when frequencies are being shared among instruments. I think about this a lot, like, when you were talking about with tracks versus real stuff, and I know we've done a whole episode about that, but if you just soloed my tracks when it's an artist that has tracks and real instruments together, if you just soloed my tracks, they'd be super thin and kind of a little weird. Like, the idea is that those things all go together, right? So I'm utilizing, and also maybe if you soloed some of, I know like with Jay-Z, for me, I had to make a bunch of his tracks be small in order for the live instruments that were covering some of that frequency range. So actually I was taking, a full range, amazing sounding stem that they created and like crushing it and taking low pass and high pass and making it like this big.
And you just said too, you did something to it dynamically. So amplitude, and you did something to it tonally. So it's like having that instinct to go, like, what does make it smaller mean? To even know what that means is
that's true.
That's just having done it.
Yeah, and so that's something that you guys should just practice doing. Like, sometimes you have to destroy to make it better. Do you know what I mean? It's like I think about that a lot. I don't just listen to an individual thing or an individual group and go, that sounds amazing, let's leave that alone and let's move on to here. I'm constantly going, okay, now I'm going to add guitar, and this guitar had tons of 400. Well, guess what? Somebody else has to lose 400 in order for this to work.
Right.
And so, that is something definitely that is in my thought process especially when we're talking about getting to the EQ part of this. And then I know that let's talk a little bit about panning, and I think we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but how much extreme panning do you do? Do you do like if you looked at your stereo channels, which are like probably playback and whatever else, are most of those like hard panned or not?
Before I answer what that looks like, I think it'd be more important just for my overall philosophy to answer the first part of your question.
Sure.
And when you were speaking earlier about panning, it made me think about this. And what this is, and I've spoken about it often, is I wish we could live in a world where we could do tons of extreme panning, but we don't. We don't in live sound because, again, it's not, that's kind of to the left, it's kind of to the right. That's 200 feet over there, and it becomes this, it's not a sonic, once things get really, if they're hard panned and in isolation. In other words, there's not a balancing element to it over here.
I was just going to say that I do a lot of hard panning, but the thing is that I create a stereo image of it opposite of each other.
Yep. And that's why when I will now go on, so for the second part of that, what I'll do if it's like, and I'll just use guitars for an example. Like I love big spread out, powerful guitars. If I can get the mix right to where they're working and they create some sort of symmetry, that's the best. But if you look at my session with my guitar centric bands, I don't do all the way and all the way. I do like 71, you know what I mean? Or something like that seems somewhere 50. So my spread is not a full spread. But if you go into stereo, if you go into playback channels, and it's a balancey, it's not a too out of whack stem, unless anything's totally skewed within its own stereo spectrum, those things are set up to where it's just a stereo. It's just stereo. If I find things are getting wanky and they're off, then I'll start correcting. But so I do have, overheads. It'll get to the point sometimes in some of my mixes to where literally nothing is like hard, where the overheads sound too weird, like a ride on that side of the arena and a hat sound. It just, so everything gets pulled in, and then you listen to it as a thing. It's not as wide, but in practice. So it's just finding the, I don't know, whatever the sweet spot is, whatever you're comfortable with, how far off. And we've talked about this. Do I just have a left right hang? Is there a mirror image other hang over there that's going to fill in the panning from this side over here to, I want to make a good musical mix. I don't want to have things that's just like comically far apart within a live space.
I think, a lot of guys get in trouble. I've been sent a couple of mixes recently where the drum kit sounds so weird to me because their cymbals are like super isolated, super high passed up, super crispy, super cymbally, and they're way the hell out here, like almost behind you a little bit. They're way out, and the rest of the drum kit, it like lives in this weird like 9-3 world. Like even the last floor tom doesn't go all the way out,
Right.
And it kind of freaks me out. It's like it's like the cymbals are in another room. They're not like part of the kit itself. And it drives me crazy because it's a drum kit. It's like, it all should be kind of cohesive and be together. I think the difference between a good mix and a champion mix are those kind of things where, you're thinking on this level of, hey, the drum kit is this whole thing. Now, I know what's happened, all right? When I listen to a mix like that, when someone has sent me that, they have their drum kit sounding probably pretty good, and it maybe isn't as far stretched out, and what they're using on the end part of it is like a plug-in in their mix to do a spreader.
Yeah, and it just gets so weird.
And it takes certain instruments and like spreads them way wider than they should be. And I get it. It makes space in your mix, but it also disconnects
totally
individual things. So that's why I'm trying to drive home the point of like, there's always reevaluation. I don't ever like set and forget something like, my thought process isn't always thinking about the kick drum, but I always go back to thinking about the kick drum every 20 minutes.
As an anchor. As a base, right?
As an anchor, right. So I just want you guys to know my process is always like, I think what makes us good, and you tell me if you think about this, but for me, I know that my thought process is I can think about something very specific and then let it go, and think about something else and be very specific and let it go. And that I'm doing this constantly, right? In my mix, I'm looking at individual things and focusing on through a mud of crap.
Right.
Right. I can focus on that glockenspiel in the playback that you can barely hear. But boy, if you don't have it in there, it's not going to make it, it's not going to sound good. So I'm very good at like focusing on those things. But I will tell you that I am constantly coming back out and like looking at the big picture of things and being like, oh, okay, because that glockenspiel is right where it is, now it's screwing up the cymbals, for instance.
Yep.
And
that's a great example. A glockenspiel in a track. Seriously, that is such a good example.
It is. I know.
Oh yeah, because that's the kind
tambourines and glockenspiels can destroy mixes in a second if you don't get them right.
They can, and if it's coming to you via a track, I guarantee you that is a signature sound in there. And if it's not in there, it will not sound right to the people that know it best. And those people that know it best are the people that matter the most, which are the artists, management, blah, 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 blah. You know, they know it so intimate. Yeah, that's so good.
But you know, those kind of things are the things that are like supposed to be felt instruments, like especially tambourine. I know I have struggled with tambourine all the time. Like, you know, it's got to be there. It's part of what makes.
But the last thing you want is lead tambourine. You know, it's right. You know, I know. I know. Here, I'll give you one. Let me give you an example. So I had to mix this thing a few months back or a month back or something like that. And in the project, there's two guitar players. One is the lead guy, and his tone just screams lead. It's always present. It's got plenty of mid-range. I mean, it's got plenty of body and everything else, but it's got that stuff that you just don't have to do much with it to make it show itself, right? The other guitar player has a much darker sound. And if you tastefully place it to where it is balanced, it is technically balanced. With the other one, it's always going to sound lower because it doesn't have that presence. So there's a moment where this guy took a solo, and he doesn't usually solo. And I kind of I had two choices. I could either make him brighter, which I tried to do at first, to where he would be brighter and I'd only have to kind of lift him, but that changed what he is. It became a sound that was not him. So what I in turn did was I decided, no, I'm just really going to have to turn him up, and he's going to have to come up more than this guy would have to come up to be heard, because tonally, because this thing not pushed far enough becomes, well, can't you hear that's a solo? I mean, clearly he's soloing, and it's like, I know, but tonally it's so dark. You're going to need it way. Do you see what I'm saying? I
totally do. Yeah,
and that was a mixed battle there. And I listened back to it, and he's kind of too loud, but I'm telling you, if I tucked him a little, it'd be like, that guy's soloing, turn him up. And it has to do with what the source is tonally. And that, again, is another example of you, when you quickly talked about making the track lower, you know, you mentioned all these things, and it's just getting that checklist in your head of like, what does it need to do, and how am I going to get it there?
Yeah.
It's so nuanced, though. It's so nuanced on how we do these things.
Oh man, it is. And like it matters. The difference between a great mix and a champion mix are those kind of little small changes and things, you know. I play a game too, like even before I kind of really start thinking about depth in my mix, I play a game called What Can I Mute?
Totally. Yeah.
Because, you know, I know that artists and musical directors and bands all think that everything that they're throwing at me is important. And I treat it as such. You know, if you're sending me 128 track, 32 tracks of playback, I get that you think that everything that is in that playback is important, but you're paying me to be the big picture guy, right? You're paying me to be, what are the things that are going to make this mix stand out? What's going to make that vocal pop? Because that's what everyone's coming to see. There are some things that I'll be balancing and putting things up and just being like, that thing, whatever it is, a little specific playback part that's getting lost in everything is doing nothing but cluttering the mix. Right. Not important. It's not being heard. It's not making an impact. In fact, it's just causing problems. That's right. And you may, if you make the decision to mute that, which I full disclosure, I've done huge bands where I've been like, nope, that's totally. Sometimes you get busted, right? Sometimes a musical director or somebody will come and be like, hey, where's that little part, whatever. And then you have to, play the political game and tell them exactly what your thought process is, which is, hey, this part isn't helping. And let me show you, I'll show you why it's not helping. Let's put it in and see, it's not helping. So I think it's your job being a live sound mixer more than a person that mixes a record, an engineer that mixes a record. A live sound mixer is also the producer. And it is those two jobs are combined when you're talking about live stuff. When you're talking about making a record, a lot of times there's an engineer and there's a producer, and the producer makes decisions about what's happening in your mix. Well, you're both. And you need to act like it, act like a producer and be like, you know what, that part sucks. I'm not using it. It doesn't work here. I would say on the normal, there's at least one or two things that I'll mute in a song, if it's a super cluttered thing, right? Or a discussion with a musical director about pulling that out of a stem. I do that a lot too. Just being like, okay, that thing that's in that stem is not helping. So what can you mute? Play that game.
Right. Yeah, totally. I know I was thinking about one act I have where it was just this thing. It was like one of my moves at the top of every show. There was no track, at least not in the opening song. And the way that I made it work, and you know how it is at the top of the show too, when the crowd is so loud and they're kind of screwing up your good mix because the noise floor is getting louder and you can't hear any detail, and all you hear, I hate that. It's like, oh, be quiet. I have this thing I work so hard on. But one of the things I would do. Hold it
down. I got this thing going.
Yeah. Quit getting your money's worth. There was a move I made where one of the guitar players, I'd mixed them for several years. At this point, I just knew it was the same opening song every time. I would never drop him in until the second verse.
Yeah.
Which is that's a studio mindset. It's a production aspect. Is I know you need to be, the artist wants you up there given the visual.
Yeah.
You and I both know there's no space for you right there.
Yeah.
So I'm just telling, I was close with the guy. I was like, I'm just letting you know you're coming in on the second verse.
Yeah.
And he's like,
and
he's like, totally, no problem.
Huge, whatever. Yeah.
And something when you were talking, I just started thinking about something else, as often happens here. I got a call or text yesterday from a buddy, and he's working on this really killer project. And he was like, hey, I've got a couple mixes. Can you listen to them for me? And I said, sure, no problem. So he sent them to me. And when I finally got to him, I listened to him, and I wasn't going to sit there and be like, I just listened a couple times. Sure. It was like, what's my key takeaway? And my key takeaway was this. And the point is that I knew the difference between, in that one, the vocal's louder versus in that one, the music is quieter. Do you see what I'm saying? I listened to the first track, and the music spoke to me. It kind of came at me a little bit, and the vocal either needed just some tweaking or needed a tiny bit of amplitude applied to it. Yep. Then I listened to the second one, and it was obvious to me that the second one, the vocal wasn't any louder in my car, but the music didn't matter as much. And so to the layperson, that could be, well, I like that version because I can hear the vocal better. And then if you ask them to further deduce why that is, they might be like, oh, I don't know, I guess they just turned that part up. I knew the difference. I wasn't listening to a vocal up mix. I was listening to a music down. So you mentioned, your kick drum is an anchor every 15 minutes. When you're listening, even think of what's the what am I hearing? What's the bass? And so that'll allow you to start figuring out the difference between, turning things down and turning things up. So I just want to make reference of that, really know what you're hearing. And when things contrast, why did they contrast? Was it from things moving upwards, or was it in fact from other things coming down, or in your situation, other things just being removed from the picture altogether, And in doing that, you're not risking running out of space, essentially.
Yeah. It's, reevaluation constantly for me. There's even times where it'll get so cluttered and weird for me. Everything now that I've built, I've been working. I get to a point where I'm just like, holy crap, it's just this big wall of shit.
Yeah.
Now, I'll like literally like turn, yeah, okay, let's turn everything down, start again, and like,
Totally.
let's build again and get things, reined in. So to me, like, that's why I was trying to stress how balance and rebalance is like the foremost thing in my head, at all times. Like even towards the end when I'm starting to get into depth, it's still, I'm still thinking like maybe some things need to be rebalanced in regards to that. So let's talk a little bit about depth. You've gotten into your mix. You've got things nicely panned, let's say, and everything is kind of living individually in its own space. And maybe even before that, you've created some space with drums or whatever. But do you have what's your like journey or thought process about making, okay, now I want to think about making things closer or farther away from me? Like, what do you...
Really, it's interesting. Yeah, as you're asking this, because I haven't mixed a big show in a while, and I've mixed, but I would say mixed sparingly compared to how much I usually mix in my life. I do, as a result of these last 8 months, like there's a few things I want to start trying to do a little different when I get back. And
Sure.
I have a feeling I'll drift back to where I've always been. I try to keep my mixes, I have tried in the past, like on an instrument level. Drums, sure, it gets verb treatment of different sorts, either to make it gel, you kind of can't hear it, to make a vibe, to make an obvious effect, to make this and that. When it comes to the instruments, the rest of the instrumentation, I'm usually, because of everything we have working against us in a live environment, like these hard walls, it's usually pretty dry. I will in rehearsals, I'll start messing with, buses of verbs for guitars and this and then they'll kind of come back out. But I have found, it's funny, during COVID, mixing here a little bit, I've found a way to where I'm getting more into some sort of reverb / ambience for instrument sources. More is just a gelling effect. I don't know, somehow it's slightly different, and I think I'm going to be able to pull it off live. So that, because it's interesting, once we've established these relationships between all these sources, once you apply depth, think about what depth literally implies.
Yeah.
So this sounds this way. Everything's balanced. Let's say this is the mix, left hand, right hand. Once we put a little verb on this, it's going to get bigger, but it's also going to kind of pull back. But it's actually at the same amplitude it just was. So then the rebalance takes on a whole other shape of dry versus wet, forward and back. So I play with delays on occasion, to create space if I don't want the smear of verb, but I want the presence.
Like shorter delays with low feedback, just to
absolutely
create space. Yeah.
Just as something. Like, in fact, I feel like I could do a whole show with just delay and make it work. I'd thicken things, give them space, give them effect. So that's kind of my thing. I do get into like spatializing things from time to time, like we've talked about this, widening of sources. I'll do some trickery here and there, but for the most part, it's verb.
Trickery and magic.
Yeah. What about you?
I think that, my philosophy in all of that is I almost never, we've talked about this before, I almost never use super long reverbs, if you looked at all my reverb settings, you'd be hard pressed to find anything like past 2, or 2.5. Yep. You know what I mean? It's like anything that's longer than 2 seconds in length is to me like a super big reverb that's just clouding what you have going on, because already we are usually in spaces that have that kind of acoustic energy already happening. Right?
Correct.
So all it does for me is clutter mixes. So you'll discover I do, we talked about this before. I do, long pre-delay times, 60, 80, 100 milliseconds with short reverb tails to create space. And that is really kind of almost like it's a delay, but it's got a little bit of reverb at the end.
It's just got a little vibe on it.
It's got just a little bit of vibe. And if placed properly, it pushes vocals at you. Like, for instance, if you use it on a vocal, it makes a dry vocal be kind of here, but if you can create space that's behind it, that's a pre-delay and a little small reverb tail, it pushes that vocal out of your mix. And it's a skill. It's like, it's taken me a lot of years to not just throw on whatever reverb. Like, I think when I first started, I was like, oh yeah, SPX 900, hall setting, whatever, 2.3. And that was like my vocal reverb, and not really thinking that it was important or that anything about it was important. But to me, like, the nuance of getting a reverb right is the difference between a vocal feeling kind of cool in the center and a vocal feeling like, holy crap, that vocal's like in my face, feels amazing.
Right.
And so those are the kind of things that I'm talking about depth wise. Those little things take your mix from great to champion. So they're important to me, like I really focus on those things, but I focus on them once everything else is kind of already working,
Yeah,
It's kind of the same thought process I have about like compression and EQ on my mix bus. But, we've talked about that. That for me is like a mastering place, I'm like, and so very nuancy, not like huge, giant compression happening on my mix bus. In that same thought process is also depth for me. Like, those are like the little things at the end, but they're the things that separate the men from the boys, I think.
Absolutely.
So
and in the overdoing it of these things.
Yes.
Is as amateur as those too high passed, spread out, falsely overheads.
Totally.
Which is just as bad as the holy grail of all sins, the too loud kick drum. Like, it's just, that's a.
And you should know, by the way, that a great deal of my mixes, the vocals have nothing on them except for maybe a chorusy kind of a thing, and then a delay for delay cues.
Yeah.
Like literally. Literally, I'm not the guy that's like bathing vocals in stuff. Most of the time, it's like vocals are dry.
Yeah. And it's so funny. Vocalists, when it comes to live sound, vocalists it wasn't so much in wedges at all, but, in their ears, they love that vocal sound. It's that thing, that verb sound. It's a thing that sort of hide in, it smears things, it masks things. But go listen to that artist's record. I guarantee you there's not 5 seconds of reverb at all. Totally. There's more like fun spatial things going on with their vocal, and particularly now, vocals, they're not dry at all, but they're not wet in the way we used to consider a vocal wet.
100%.
And I was mentioning earlier how I've started to kind of gel things more on an instrument level. I can tell you for many, many years, this is a function of having a lot of times I'll do this with like internal reverbs off of in the desk. But, now where we've got all the auxes we want, we've got all this and that, I always, whether it's whatever the source is, I've always got a few flavor of verbs for them too in mind, where I've always got like a room and then a taily thing. So, and then so now we're getting into the balancing of those versus one another. Do I just want to give it a little, do I want to make it like where you're talking about making that vocal pop? Then there's the thing that's just bone dry, hanging out right in front of you. That's like, do something with that. It's too naked. And in a room can excite it, spread it just so much where, then we start getting the tails and we can talking about very obvious effects or just even further pushing back. So for me, I'm always thinking in terms of what am I doing with these? What are these things? What's their role? What are these elements of embellishment? How much are they supposed to do? But they matter so much, and overdoing it is just as bad. Overdoing it might be worse than not doing anything.
Yeah,
you know?
for sure. I've been experimenting recently with messing with the EQ of the send to the reverb.
Yeah, I'm a big
so that, like, you know, I'm sending to, let's say it's a short reverb with a long pre-delay, like what I like on a vocal. But the send that I would do years and years, what I did was just send it straight, you know, aux send straight from whatever the vocal sound is now going to the reverb, right? And so the reverb return is a reverb, but it has all of the EQ characteristics of what that vocal has. Try experimenting with taking the EQ and like high passing it way up and send what you're sending to the reverb is more splatty kind of you know, vocal.
There's a big difference in there. In
that is way different, by the way, guys, than EQing the return.
Way different
of what's happening. So those are two tools that you should check out, like EQing the send and compressing the send even to the reverb versus doing EQ of the return of the reverb, and learn what the differences of those sounds are. They're completely different sounding things.
Yeah, for sure.
And I've been experimenting with that a lot recently, and I like the result, especially on vocals. So that, you know, if you've got a vocalist that has lots of full range, you know, like Bruce Dickinson, for example, he's, you know, he can go all the way from ooh to, you know, screaming, super high scream stuff. If you eliminate some of the low end part of his vocal being sent to a reverb, it cleans that reverb up.
Totally.
Even though that low end part of his vocal is kind of dry now because that part of his vocal is not being sent to the reverb, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I wanted to say real quick the same point. I used to hear back in the day before everybody had the ability to bus everything, or you couldn't, you know, whatever, very easily. A lot of times people would get a big fat snare sound and they were doing it with just, let's say they were doing it with a snare top and they had a snare bottom. They were only sending snare reverb from the bottom because they wanted the brighter. Whereas, you know, I'll do that. Whereas I just go to my send a lot of times. Like I want all those frequencies we talk about loving. I want all that tubby stuff, and I don't want it in the reverb, but just taking it out of the reverb equation is a different sound than getting the return and scooping it there. Cause you're literally, I mean, it's just a whole other sound. That being said, it's not an either or. I'll do both all the time.
Totally. Yeah. No. I'm not saying it's either or. I'm saying they're two different sounds, and you should know, you should ear train yourself to learn which you should be using in what situation.
And know this too, guys, you could send like, I'm talking about drums. Let's say you've got a snare sound that's from an ungated snare top and a gated bottom or something like that, or just only an ungated snare top. Nowadays, with that path, as complex as everything is, you can not only EQ that send to wherever, you can gate just the send, you know, so you can lose all that hi-hat, or if you have a vocal that you can't get away with like expansion on with the dry source, well, you sure as shit can do it with the send, like clean stuff up. Or I'll tell you right now with Bruno Mars all the time, his mic is so incredibly hot that I DS to some degree almost all the effect sends. Anything that's and it's not even because it's really not what it does to the mix. It's like on a set it off in the room level.
Totally.
So like a lot of the delays, everything, you'll go to them, you'll see these DSers just going, and it's already happening on the channel, but I do it even more. So, you know, somehow we've wandered into this, but get creative with your sends. You can do so much, you know?
Well, I think we wandered into this just to show you that there are a bunch of different ways for the depth part of thinking about your mix process. And when I get to this point, there's all kinds of ways. You know, you were talking about snare drum and having the gate to the send be there. There's a really interesting sound that happens if you eliminate ghost note snaring out of the reverb.
Out of the verb, right.
If it's only that big hit, it makes this, wow, like the ghost notes are now dry, right? And then the big snare drum is a big hit,
which can
really cool stuff.
And if you think about, I hope I can formulate this thought right, because it ties into everything we said. The ghost notes, which are typically lower in amplitude, are now going to be drier, therefore further up, it's like it works.
Correct. Yeah, making depth wise too, you know.
So it's like a happy accident of sorts, you know, with something like that. I'll tell you what, something else fun, you know, we're talking about ways to do depth. You know, no, we're starting to talk about maybe getting creative with your use of effects or whatever your spatial tools are, your time-based tools. I will always try on a tour to have, I've usually got like a roomy, short, vibey sort of thing that's like however much I use it, it just depends. But man, I'm always trying to, my favorite sound in the world, in all of produced music is the sound of drum rooms. Whether it's over the top, Zeppelin, like, you know, or if it's just that, oh man, you know, like that's a great snare sound. It's like, you know what you love about that? You love the room of it.
Yeah,
you
right.
love the psh, psh. So I'm always trying to make this like room, and you can do it best with two things. One, a great super high-end reverb like a Bricasti, or just the worst piece of garbage or the grainiest onboard thing. Take that, squash it. Yeah. Mess with like pummeling that thing like you would with like a distressor or whatever else with room mics. And I'm always trying to like tuck that in there. And man, you start to get into attack and release times with that. You can really make drums move and pump and in creative ways. So I don't know. It's just another
sometimes thing. You know, I think we're saying the same thing, but sometimes lo-fi is actually better. Right?
But for definitely.
Yeah. Especially sometimes I'll experiment with, you know, taking a reverb and just making it super like lo-fi, like making it sound like it's 8-bit, you know, just super crunchy and nasty. And, you know, you listen to it by itself and you're like, you know, it's just whatever distorted, you know, thing. But in the scope of all of it, you're like, whoa, that's pretty killer on the snare drum or, you know, whatever.
Right.
So,
but it's funny, we're talking about all this stuff and everything we've mentioned in this last step, depth, or I labeled it as embellishment as being my final step. Like none of this is even possible unless you've got the steps before it, even remotely.
That's right.
If you haven't gotten balance and both spectrally, you know, tonally, in terms of amplitude, if those things aren't right, you don't even make it to this part of the show.
That's
like you don't.
Right.
But this is the stuff that starts to separate you, you know.
This is the end part of this is what, like I said, you know, it takes a great mix and makes it into like people walking up to you going, dude, like what are you doing? It's all of those little nuancy things that are, you know, make all the difference in the world. But you can't have those nuancy things unless you have your balance right, unless everything's, you know,
totally.
Unless it's all living in there nicely and stuff is playing together nice, you can't make something feel like it's pushed forward and has depth, you know? So cool. Well, that was a little hour on what, you know, our thought process is of as we mix. You know, Chris and I have similar thought processes. We probably, like if you put us side by side and said, here's 32 tracks, both of you have the same 32 tracks, and we both go at it, we would approach them a little bit differently. But those 5 things are always at the forefront of our mind as we're working.
Sure.
So thanks for tuning in, guys. We hope you got some of that stuff. Little nuancy things at the end are important. And we'll see you soon. Thanks for tuning in.
Yep. All right. See you, everybody.